Good afternoon and welcome to this conversation with Professor Tony Bogues, or Anthony Bogues, who is the Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory and the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. He is also a visiting professor and curator at the University of Johannesburg. He's the author and editor of 8 books in the fields of intellectual history, political theory, and art, including Black Heretics, Black Prophets, Radical Political Intellectuals, and the rather gorgeous Metamorphoses, The Art of Edward Duval-Carrier. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Apropos today's conversation, I'd like to mention also particularly his Empire of Liberty, Power, Desire, and Freedom, which is a book that I found very useful in my own writing of At Freedom's Limit, Islam and the Post-Colonial Predicament. He has curated exhibitions in USA, Caribbean, and South Africa. He is currently working on a book titled Black Critique and editing with Badur Al-Gra a volume on Sylvia Wynter's work, as well as writing 2 intellectual biographies, one on C.L.R. James and the other on Sylvia Wynter. He's the co-convener of 2 major exhibition projects, one titled Slavery, Colonialism, and the Making of the Modern World with the National African American Museum of History and Culture, and the other an African and African diasporic contemporary art project / platform on Black Lives Today, titled Imagined New. His articles have also appeared in the Financial Times, and he is a regular columnist for the South African newspaper Mail and Guardian. Today, we will be talking about 3 articles he has published in the Mail and Guardian about the current situation in the United States over the past 6 months or so. I think they're very significant, and they're also very systematic in laying out for us all over the world some of the current crises and contradictions of the United States. The first was about the BLM protests this summer. In the time of the now, social is all important. The second is We Grabbed Him by the Vote. This is about, published in November. This is about the election outcome. And then after January 6, this year, he published The Chickens Have Come Home to Roost, Anti-Democracy in American Politics. I should also add that Tony has been involved in politics and was in Michael Manley's government at one point and walked away from that. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. But I lay all of this out partly because I think that the breadth and capacity of Professor Bogues' interests and output are inspiring for us all. And it's good to know that intellectuals do all kinds of things. Welcome, Tony.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Sadia. That's a really great introduction. Kind of had to look around to see who you was talking about, but thank you.
Well, just you. So I have, I've been reading these articles very closely, right? And they're very systematic, which is one of the things I like about it. I'm going to start by asking you a couple of questions that are maybe linked, maybe not. One is about the fundamental contradictions in America, right? What are they? The other one, and you can choose which question you want to address first, right? One of the things that I found so striking about the last one that you wrote, which is just after the Capitol Hill takeover, was The Chickens Come Home to Roost, right? And what you address in that also is the myth of American innocence and the myth of American exceptionalism. You've written these articles for a South African newspaper. One of the things that I found particularly interesting and frustrating about all the coverage in the United States is that there's no understanding of the international component and the international imbrication of this event in, around things like Chile and the Monroe Doctrine, in the way that we're talking about it. This is, on the one hand, we have an inauguration in which we address the world, right? People address the world, and even young poets like Amanda Gorman, sort of speaks to the world out there. On the other hand, we treat it as if this is a purely domestic matter, right? And I think that what's particularly interesting to me is that you are an internationalist, right, of a particular school. And I think we need to have this conversation in international terms.
Mhm.
So what is the international component? Why is it important to pay attention to it?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for reading the articles. To answer the question about the fundamental contradictions of America would take us about a week, because I don't think there is, um, I don't think there's a kind of fundamental set of contradictions. It's a old mode of thinking that if you can find the fundamental contradictions, then you'll have the master key to unlock what is to be done, to use a very old language. But I don't think that there is I think there are multiplicity of contradictions, and here I'm following Stuart Hall very closely, and that those multiplicity of contradictions are re-articulated and remap themselves within on each other. So obviously, one of the things when you think about United States is to think about the ways in which I call what I said the two original sins have shaped America. One is racial slavery. The other one is the dispossession of the indigenous population. That you can't think about, therefore, America without not thinking about secular colonialism and racial slavery as the inaugural moment. And if that's the inaugural moment, then what are the logics of that operate through and the entire historical processes of over 200 years? And the one narrative that people have is that, okay, even if we began with these, with racial slavery and dispossession of Indian population, that what has happened is that United States has become much more inclusive, so that there's a question of a kind of expansion of equality, and that in that expansion of equality, then you get more African Americans, you get more women, etc., and then you get they could not say you get more indigenous population because the indigenous population was reduced dramatically through processes of genocide, so, and put on reservations. So that I think the way I like to think about it is to think about, okay, how do you think about American liberalism, and how do you think about liberalism in general when liberalism is actually born in a moment of historical catastrophe, is born within the moments of racial slavery and dispossession of the indigenous population, and that therefore, if you put those two things together, then one of the question then becomes, then how do you think about democracy? Not now just the business of the right to vote, which is an essential part of democracy, but how do you think about democratic politics? How do you think about democracy writ large? How do you think about how people can live together in forms of what I like to call common association? All those things are, in my view, critical to trying to understand to understand United States. So it's not that there is just kind of one contradiction. There are a set of layered contradictions in which we then can kind of in which we can discern and dispatch as the way in which we can then think about a master key, but really to think about the ways in which the historical foundations of the society, the inauguration of America, which has a narrative of liberalism and exceptionalism and innocence and all of those things, and of ever expanding inequality, to think about how, in fact, those two particular things operate like what I call sediment deposits. I mean, James Baldwin has a phrase in which he says, history travels in the body. And I think that one, I'm paraphrasing here, and is this business of trying to see what I call kind of historical sediments that then travel through time, that actually shape the structures, that shape the relationships of the society. So that therefore, at this particular point, one of the fundamental things that we have is in America is that you have a certain kind of nostalgia for a past based on a historical understanding, and that past is about white settlerism and patriarchy. Um, and so that then becomes ground for what? For a certain kind of politics, a certain kind of extreme right wing, for Trumpism, for the conspiracy theorists, and so on and so forth. But you can't think about that without not thinking about the kind of ways in which the historical narrative of the United States has been shaped by the dominant, what Gramsci would call the hegemony, the kind of hegemonic national historical narrative, how that then has shaped people, how that then operates into what I call a fantasy. And how that fantasy then begins to shape politics. And so therefore, if you ask me, one of the things to about America that I think is important is that America is a society where the idea, in my view, of spectacle and fantasy are actually intertwined, and where the business of spectacle and fantasy is that the because the conventional narrative is that America is an idea, and in one sense it is true. But what is the idea? And how does that idea get transmitted? How does that idea of a certain kind of fantasy and spectacle then actually rearranges American life? And so that to think about America is to think about capitalism, yes, but is also to think about what I call a certain kind of surplus and capitalism that then creates spectacle, and how all of that, in fact, then begins to shape the certain kind of practices and ideas that emerge out of the historical foundations that I have talked about. So that's how I see. That's my long answer to your questions about not wanting to kind of to narrow myself into a kind of simplistic thing. This is the contradiction, but actually trying to understand a certain ways in which I think America as a history, and how that history works upon us today. But while doing that, one also has to think about certain structures of capital and the way in which the structures of capital works through the business of spectacle and so on. So let me stop there.
No, I think that's actually great, and I'm glad. I mean, I realized the minute you started responding that you were hearing it as my kind of, a kind of old Marxist language of the primary contradiction, which wasn't quite what I was thinking. But I mean, but but I'm glad that it prompted precisely that answer, because, and I love the fact that you talked about the two original sins, right? Native dispossession and racial slavery, right? Which are, because I think both are constitutive, but it's also very interesting because I've been reading actually a lot in the past, just for the chapter I'm writing for my own book right now, in the past couple of months on both the American myths, or the set of American myths, right? So I've been reading Richard Slotkin's whole volume on 3 volumes on, the Gunfighter Nation, Fatal Environment, and so on about America. So I've just gotten a kind of radical education in American studies about the myth of the frontier, the myth of the West, the American hero. I found myself going back to D.H. Lawrence and his book on American literature, which I'm teaching actually at the moment. And I'm really, trying to think that through, while I'm also reading a lot of Native writers like Gerald Wisner and Louise Erdrich and Jody Bird. And the reason I list these is actually also for our audience, because part of, I believe, what such conversations should do is open up uh, things that people can follow up on, right? Books included, and so on. But I think that so I think the sense of a kind of the three things that you mentioned that you bring together, I mean, you mentioned many things, but slavery, indigenous dispossession, and this really intriguing notion of a surplus in capital that creates spectacle, right? And that's a very precise and very distinct notion of spectacle, right? So could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, there are two. This is what I'm thinking. That there is a way in which when we think through capitalism, and we think about questions of surplus, we tend to actually locate it into surplus value only, and that's fine. I have no difficulty with that. I have a difficulty in developing, in creating histories of capitalism which only talk about wage labor. I think there's I'm working on a project now. One of the projects I'm working on now is actually trying to think through with a group of scholars the ways in which, in fact, the history of capitalism is also a history of unfree labor, and how those, which means moving out of the moving out of England, and out of Europe, and moving, quite frankly, to America, and also into the Caribbean colonies specifically. Right? That's one thing. But what I'm thinking of surplus here is, this is what I'm thinking, that there is in America, and very much in the world, but so much more in America, there is the role of credit becomes extremely important. It just cast our minds back to post 9/11, and the horror of the towers and so on. But then what did the president say after he gave a speech about America and so on, and the need to defend America, and all the usual things? What did he say? He said, "Go out and spend." And there are a couple of things about that. One is that there is the actual engine of the economics is credit, right? And credit is about a certain kind of surplus, right? And so that what you are getting is that you are what drives that drives a great deal of the American economy is the capacity of people to spend, and so, and capacity for people to be in credit and to have credit and so on and so forth. But secondly, and this is a line to this, is that the question, there is a certain financialization, therefore, which becomes important. So I mean, so if you think about it, Sadia, that in the middle of a pandemic, when there's unemployment, when people are hurting and so on, and you listen to the stock exchange and you read the FT, Financial Times, or the Wall Street, these things are doing well. So you then have to, but the economy is tanking. So you then have to ask yourself the question: what is it? What is the connection between this? I mean, if there's a certain kind of financialization process, so there's a certain, which is what I'm calling excess. So there's a certain excess there that then allows and it's excess around what Marx would call fictitious capital in many ways, in which there's buying and selling of stocks and so on and so forth, and that sort of business. So that's that's one level. The level is a kind of excess of capitalism, the capitalism that I talk about. But there's another excess, right? And that's one I am really interested in, because that one you can, you just have to read the financial newspapers, and you can pick it up, and you just have to listen to, read Business Week, etc. But or listen to Bloomberg. But the other thing that's more difficult is something I tried to talk about in Empire of Liberty, and that is the way in which that excess actually then transforms our subjectivities. In other words, the ways in that excess actually transforms our desire, it way in which it then shapes us and creates certain kind of subjectivities, what Althusser would call it certain kind of interpolation, the way in which therefore as subjects we become interpolated inside a particular inside a particular social order. And that excess has to do with a certain kind of consumerism, with a certain kind of way in which we think about what life is, and ways in which, particularly under neoliberalism, the life has been reduced to a certain kind of transactional calculation. So, I mean, part of, I think, what Trump was speaking to was that. In other words, that he as a businessman and a so-called marketeer, he tapped into those kind of things. Now, what you have, which, and this is why America is so complicated, I think, is what you have is that you have at one level of the social order what some of us what might call a kind of imaginary institution of the social order. You have these things operating, they're not named, right? But the desire and the imagination is operating in these through these structures of a kind of the excess that I'm talking about. But at another level, what you have, and there are no kind of, there's not one level up here and another level only, but a kind of, I mean, what Stuart called the articulation, right? What you would then have is, and you talk about your thing with American studies, what you have is, and here I think the most important things are the Westerns. What you have are therefore is are the a certain set of narratives, which again are about the imagination, which again are about a desire, which are about re-inscribing some kind of subjectivities about who you are. And what you have, particularly for the white population, is the lost cause. So
Yes.
that, right, so that the ways in which therefore nostalgia then operates then becomes important. I mean, we're all on lockdown. So, I spend, I mean, one tries to work, but I also spend a lot of time, quite frankly, looking at these old Western movies. And it is just, and I mean, there's a channel called Me Too, which is a channel for older people. And I'm older. But what is interesting is the way is the kind of movies that they show. So the 1950s, the 1960s, 1970s movies, and then you think to yourself as you watch these, okay, how does this reinscribe a certain imagination about the subjectivity of self, and it's all around the lost cause. So that what's the point I'm making? The point I'm making, therefore, is that if you have the business of this excess of capitalism I'm talking about in terms of structural political economy and so on, which then reworks itself in certain kind of inscriptions and kind of conscripts us, interpolates us into certain subjectivities and create certain desires, and that is then mixed up with the business of lost cause. Then what you have is a situation in which the questions that I've talked about, dispossession, racial slavery, and all the consequences of those things are actually minimized in the country, are not seen as being part of the agenda. Final point. So that even when, for example, Biden establishes a thing in his office, a major project in his office headed by Susan Rice around equity. It is looking at, say, the structure. So, okay, what is the housing thing? How does the housing thing work? What does what are some of the federal policies and so on that discriminate? And that's, I mean, please, that's very important. Not knocking that, but then those are, you cannot think about those outside of trying to re-narrativize and trying to think about a different history and a different way to think about what and who is in America and what is America. Because what you are doing in that very noble effort, and I applaud it and so on, is that you're actually saying that somehow that the country is always about an expansion of equality. It is not. The country is always about a reinscription of has been in its history, a reinscription of a set of bodies who are considered outside of the pale, who are black bodies in particular, indigenous people, who are seen as not quite up to par, with what I call a few exceptions, right? Who somehow go to Harvard or Ivy Leagues or whatever, and make it. But the structures of what I'm talking about is not an inclusive structure. It's always a structure that actually has to have the waste. It always has to have disposable bodies. It always has to have bodies that cannot be incorporated into the mainstream. All right, let me stop there.
That's great. I mean, again, so much there. I should say that I just taught John Ford's The Searchers this week. So I've been, my course I'm teaching is Imagining America, and in which we're doing, and Fenimore Cooper, we're doing today, in fact, later today. And I've been trying to get my students to think about precisely those questions. So I'll make sure that they watch this this conversation. It's and of course, to me, as somebody who came here at 18 from Pakistan and Singapore, which is where I'd grown up, Singapore as a child and then later Pakistan. It was kind of baffling, the role of the Confederacy. And because it's very interesting, right? I mean, if you know anything about the Americas, then you can read the codes. But I mean, Westerns are going to be watched abroad as well. And I remember at one point, my professor at Wellesley College, you probably know him, Selwyn Cudjoe, once gave a talk. He would talk about what it was to identify in these cowboy and Indian, as he put it, films with the cowboys. Here we are cheering them on. And of course, Louise Erdrich, whose poem Dear John Wayne I'm also teaching today, does precisely that. I mean, from a native, she's addressing John Wayne watching a Western. So there's this whole imagination there. You're, as you put it, right? But at the same time, there's the lost cause in there, right? Because I mean, of course, John Wayne is a Confederate soldier in The Searchers, and and the only reason I knew to ask this time, or was attentive even before he declared it in the film, was that a few months ago, R.A. Judy was watching Open Range, the Kevin Costner film, and I walked in there, and I don't particularly like Westerns, never have, and he said, and he pointed to Kevin Costner, and he said, "That's a bushwhacker. He's a bushwhacker." And my question, I was like, "What's a bushwhacker?" Right? And then I looked up bushwhacker on Google. And it's amazing how much obfuscation there is. And he told me that it was these militias that were aligned with the Confederacy, right? Now, you come in as an immigrant from South Asia, say, right? You have no idea what you're watching. And this is also to speak to your question of inclusion, right? And disposability, right? So immigrants come in, especially South Asian immigrants, Arab immigrants, but South Asian immigrants and Pakistani immigrants, for instance, who came in after the post-immigration, the Immigration Rights Act, for which Black Americans had fought, right? Came in as many of them. I mean, I'm not talking about the taxi drivers. I'm also talking about all the doctors, right? Who came in as relatively privileged immigrants. And of course, their inclusion for a long time until 9/11 became a way of also, and Du Bois said that early, right? Became a way of masking the internal internal inequalities, right? So we're complicit. I mean, and I think that on the question of debt, Ayad Akhtar's new book, Homeland Elegies, which is about debt post 9/11, is very interesting. So, there's spectacle, there's imagination, and of course, part of that spectacle has to do, as you're saying, with surplus, the surplus of capital, an excess, a kind of managed excess, I think. And it also has to do with the frontier, because of course, when the expanse has to be taken, right?
Yes.
And once the expanse is taken, what is the rest of the expanse, right? I mean, there's this kind of, so you have to invent an expanse as well, or you have to keep taking it outwards, which leads me to the other question I asked, right, which was about the Monroe Doctrine, but also about the international component, because of course, again, Native scholars have also talked about how even in Iraq, and and I've written about it too, there's a kind of spread of that frontier mentality to the planet itself. And of course, there's the Pacific, there's the Philippines, there's the Caribbean War, there's so it's all over the place. There's Chile, as you say, in 1973. So I'm watching the Capitol riot, and I'm thinking of Mossadegh in Iran. I'm thinking of Chile. I'm thinking of Ziaul Haq in Pakistan, right? So talk about
I mean, I think that one of the things that is important is that there are many, but there are two currents within American politics that expanded outside the borders, the conventional territorial borders of United States. And one of those policies is to hit you on the head. Okay. Is might is right. Okay. It is if you recall the history, America becomes, at the beginning of the 19th century, it becomes an important world power. The 20th century was called the American century, and by Henry Lucy. And part of all of that is about establishing American power, but also establishing American power within the context of, in the early 20th century, quite frankly, of colonialism. When we think of the scramble for Africa, we don't think of America, but the American vice president was in the meeting in Berlin. If you look at the actual founding, the original documents and debates, the Americans were there. And they were there because they wanted to make sure that they had a say in the actual carving up of Africa itself. They were also there because they had a set of ideas about race, which were very important, and questions of science and civilization, all those things. I mean, and if you read those, if you read the Berlin Conference documents, all those ideas, all those things are discussed. Okay, but what is also very interesting is that simultaneously that they're in the table, even though they don't get an American, not a piece of there's no part of Africa that said, let's give it to America in the way it happens with the French and the German, and the British. What is important is that inside, in Hawaii, in Puerto Rico, and so on, they are colonizing. But this is the interesting thing. They are the rules and regulations, what Foucault would call the kind of technologies of governing, the governmentality of these things. You can trace back to Sadia. You can trace back to a sort of Indian court cases that were happening simultaneously. Right, as to how to make the Native American the other, to be part of the nation, but not part of the nation. And all the laws, all the Supreme Court cases that were done at that time. And then those Supreme Court cases influenced how they began to think about Cuba first, and also in the Spanish-American War, but also how they began to think about Puerto Rico, or they thought about, and later on how they thought about Hawaii. So that there, in other words, that to think about the American century at the beginning of the 20th century, to think about colonization going, happening in Africa and so on, but also then to think about what are the Americans doing, in so-called their own backyard, besides being present at the Berlin conference. What is interesting is, and I've written about this, is that these colonization projects of the American are all done under the rubric of empire of liberty. In other words, that the Jeffersonian phrase taken from Burke, Edmund Burke, that the idea that what we were doing was that we weren't going to knock these people on the head. We were going to actually, kind of present liberty to them. I mean, all of that is a contradiction, as you know. I mean, you don't present liberty to people and colonize them. I mean, that's just two different. That's just two different things. I mean, to use your that's contradiction par excellence. That simply doesn't happen. So I think we want to think about that. We also we want to think about that also has related to the internal thing. In other words, there is no way you can think about the external politics as and so-called have the split between foreign and domestic. There is a way in which these things come back, come back into the domestic. So the point I'm making is that there's a complex process of colonization, which is about empire of liberty, and then there's the might is right. I know and if we can just, I mean, I hate periodizations, but if you can periodize the 20th century, so if the early part of the 20th century is about trying to internally think about manifest destiny and the westward push and the defeat of the indigenous population through a massive set of wars, and then outside in places like Cuba, Haiti, which it occupied between 1919 and 1915 rather, to 1935. Then, and to think about the ways in which, therefore, the American colonial power is operating, and that relationship between some of the laws and about that have been constructed around indigenous people and putting them on reservations, and are they citizens, are they not citizens, etc. Those that kind of question. And then by in the post-World War II period, the business of communism. And here it is not about empire of liberty. Here is about knocking you on the head. Just in other words, if you are not not within the camp of America and so-called capitalism and so-called democracy and so on, then we will knock you on the heads. And it's really about American business, quite frankly, the ways in which a country has to be open for American business. And that, I think, becomes really important. So that when, for example, which is what I tried to say in the article, when I see, for example, that people storming the Capitol building, and then I see everybody wringing their hand and so on, I understand, and I wring my hand too. But then I also have at the back of my head, but this is what the American state did in Chile. This is what it did in Iraq. This is what it did in Guatemala. This is what it did in Jamaica in the 1970s. This is what it did in when the revolution imploded in Grenada. In other words, that I can't separate that what happened on January the 6th from the action of the American state abroad, particularly as America then becomes a world power in the so-called American century of the 20th century. And I think that one of the things that we don't think about so much in America is that we and you talk about the contradictions and so on, is that we miss the fact that this is our empire, that this country operates as an empire, and that even if it is an empire of liberty, it is nevertheless an empire. And it is that, and that it therefore practice is technologies of rule are going to be about are about imperial power. And so it is going to try and shift or intervene in spaces where it thinks it needs to intervene. It is going to, you have to think about an American state. There's something, we all, talk about the finding the limits of to the capacity of the American state, of the state. And what do we say? What do we say about the state? One of the things we say about the state is that the state has this capacity to kill. One of the ways in which you want to think about liberalism, right, is actually, okay, how does liberalism hinder? How does it control? How does it impede? How does it reduce? And what are the boundaries around it sets up around the American state capacity to kill? And just think of the drones and the way in which the drones operate even in Pakistan. That's the capacity, that's the American state having the capacity to kill, and having the capacity to kill without any kind of quote unquote liberal institutional framework that stops it. Right? That hinders it. It doesn't, it just have to, some few people have to identify quote unquote as the enemy, and then that enemy is killed along with so-called quote unquote collateral damage. So but that is how empires operate. And so that I can't think about Americans and American state power without not thinking. I can think domestically, but I also have to think what happens to the people outside of American boundaries.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is I have to say that there's a lot in there, and I want to talk about a bunch of them. I'll start with the last stuff first, which is one of the reasons I felt that we really did have to have this conversation, right, was precisely because I was watching those Capitol riots, right, and not a lot of hand wringing. I kind of, and I said in a conversation recently which is also up on Ideas and Features with Fred Moten and RA, that I felt strangely at home. Mm-hmm. Right, and that wasn't a claim of Schadenfreude, right? It was actually that it looked very familiar, right? It looked incredibly familiar. I mean, I did live through the Zia coup. I was thinking of what America's always had a role in Pakistan, and I kept reciting in my head this litany of Latin American countries and Chile and Nicaragua and Mossaddeq's Iran and so on, and and what it was, and I spoke to R.A. Judy about this, and it was, and I said, why does this look so familiar? I mean, this isn't just, and I was trying to get to the heart of it, and it had something to do with, that there was something so naked about the power, right, and which I think speaks to this question of without liberal oversight, without, and also to something you say, quoting Don Pease, and I think it's in the last piece, but in one of them, where this distinction between liberal and illiberal hegemony, right? And so you could say that there's a kind of, what Trump unveiled, in some sense, was the illiberal hegemony. And of course, Don Pease is drawing upon that foreign affairs piece, right? Which is about a liberal hegemony, and that's what Trump had. But of course, part of what you're saying is that question of might is right has always been there, right? That oscillation between liberal and illiberal forms of domination has always been there. And this question of the state is also interesting because there's a kind of withdrawal into the nation state when we want to talk about suturing those questions internally, and those become about addressing the issue of equality. right? So we expand equality, and that's somehow going to resolve the problem of the nation state, right? But even when we are doing that, and this is what I'm taking away, right? In some sense, I'm adding to it what you're saying, I think, or interpreting it, is that even when we're doing that very incomplete and inadequate kind of dance of equal inclusion, right? Of expanding inclusion, there's no capacity, right, to think about the rest of the world. So on the one hand, there's an address to the world. So even a 22-year-old young woman can give a poem, can read a poem in which her conclusion is to come into the light and then to be the light, and basically channel John Winthrop without knowing it, right, at some level, and address the world. And I asked my students, I said, well, how do you think this looks to the rest of the world? And they couldn't answer. I mean, they were intrigued. I mean, they're very good students. They're wonderful. It's Rutgers Newark. You've been there. It's a very, it's a very different sort of space. It's very, it's working class. It's diverse. But they couldn't think about that, right? So there's a way in which it's an imperial presidency, right? The empire is always being addressed, yes, especially in those moments of the renewal of innocence.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But it's never really acknowledged. I mean, it's this incredible move, and so when I read the latest piece, and then I started reading all of them, and I was like, we really need to have much more of this conversation, because, and we need to have it here too. Right. I mean, with our students, and I know you do. I try to. But it's also that, so what was familiar then was the nakedness of the power, right? And I have to confess that and I was angry too, right? And I was angry at the way that they kept on saying this isn't who we are.
Yes.
Right. That this is recurrent. And I'm like, no, but it is, right? But also, and then they kept saying, which and I don't use the word offended, right? But I was actually offended when they kept saying, we're becoming a third world country.
Yes.
And I'm like,
but Banana Republic was the
word. Banana Republic or third world country. I'm like, for one thing, whatever you associate with a third world country, you helped create. Right, all of those contradictions, number one. Number two, don't insult third world countries. Right? I mean, they're much more aware of what they're having to live with, what they deal with. I mean, this kind of this obsession, that this need to be innocent, right, is extraordinary. And one of the things that I also noticed was that, and this is before January 6th, right, was in Biden's acceptance speech, where he was still saying we're the best and we will lead with the example of our power and by the power of our example. And people were nodding, right? Good liberals were nodding in the audience of every color, right? And I said, what is this that requires this kind of moral bribery? What is the subjectivity that needs to be told this over and over and over again? What will fracture if you don't tell people this, right?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is absolutely true, and because I think that, when I watched the 6th, and with pen and paper, because I do journalistic articles, I'm trying to make sure I can capture stuff that that my old memory can remember when I sit down to write. And I kept on saying to myself, but this is not you created banana republics.
Thank you. Yes.
You are the ones that created them, particularly in Latin America, with United Fruit Company, and to try and Nicaragua, so that United Fruit Company could own those countries.
Literally.
Literally own them. So that's you. And that therefore this is not exceptional. But you see, I think that one of the things, and this is where I think the work of Donna Pease is really, for me, is important.
I think so.
Is that if you have a country that is constructed with two original sins, slavery and dispossession. And then you have a revolution, 1776.
Right.
And that revolution is around, has as its political framework liberty. But it is a liberty while you are dispossessing the Indians and you are having and black folks, you have them in slavery. Then I would argue that from Jump Street, from day one, you have to construct another set of narratives about about your exceptionalism. That there's a logic to that kind of situation where you are talking about liberty, you're yelping liberty, but you are doing all these other things. And so that you have because your practices and your ideas are supposed to be not supposed to be that, but you are engaged in that. And so there's a dissonance, but it is not a dissonance of disavowalness. You are doing it and you recognize that you are doing it. And you construct laws and so on around that because so you are doing it willfully. And in the case of the indigenous population, it is about a set of laws and a set of war practices, which quite frankly are about annihilation. I mean, if for racial slavery is that you have to find ways to reproduce labor in a racialized way and in slavery, but indigenous population, you're not interested in that. What you're interested in is annihilation. So it's two different processes that are operating, but you're operating these two different processes under the banner of crime, liberty, and equality and happiness and so on. It therefore seems to me that if you are doing that, then you also have to construct another set of narratives, and that narrative is about the exception. And so America, it becomes the exception. The New England, the history of New England becomes John Winthrop, the city on the hill, and so on. And so you are doing all of that as a way and as a way to think, to construct and to create a different kind of subjectivity. This is why when people say, again, I come back to the idea of America as an idea, it is about the construction of a certain subjectivity. But it's a subjectivity that has to do with white folks. So I want to make that clear. So it's also a subjectivity that has to do with white supremacy. So although it can't be done under that banner because you are talking about equality and so on.
Right.
So the idea, so the myth of the exception, the myth of God, the city on the hill, of God's gift to mankind, to humankind, and so on and so forth. All of that becomes really very important, while at the same time you're practicing certain things. And so what I have tried to argue is that for those of us who are theorists, who spend time trying to kind of dissect and think about liberal ideas and so on and so forth, that we might best think about liberalism not as a set of normative political ideas, but actually think about them as a set of practices and a set of contradictory practices that are happening, because they are rooted in the Atlantic world. They are rooted in dispossession and in racial slavery. So I therefore think that what you have identified, and this is why I come back to a certain idea of no spectacle, and no spectacle now relating to fantasy, is that there is a way in which, therefore, that construction over 200 and odd years of this exceptional of God, God's gift to humankind and so on and so forth, becomes really a fantasy. Becomes a fantasy, so that in a certain spectacle that makes up the country. And this is a certain kind, because if you think about it, right, and it struck me first when I came here, because I've lived here for 16 years, that when I go from the East Coast, like say, I live in Providence, and say I go to Chicago to give a talk, or somewhere, and I'm sitting down with colleagues, what are they talking about? They are talking about a film that they have seen, They are talking about a series on the television. I mean, it's when people just eating and, taking it easy. So this is not a criticism of what people are talking about. But it struck me that what actually holds the country together in many ways is actually the screen. What is it that people see on the actual screen itself, right? And that therefore the business of the spectacle is what I try to understand. Okay, so that you are what holds is that I come from the East Coast, and I look somewhere, I dress a certain kind of way, etc. But you are in the Midwest and you do this, or you're in California and you do this. So what ties all of this or in your South, this is what you do. So what ties all of that is a certain kind of, not we are Americans, but what ties that together is a certain spectacle and there's a certain fantasy, which then ties everybody into this thing that is called America. So that to me is important. And so that when I hear people say, for example, not in my name, I understand what they're trying to do when certain, but in what they're trying to do is to how should I put it, break the kind of hegemonic fantasy that actually exists inside the United States. But that fantasy is tied together, and here I'm really working on, again, working through Stuart Hall, is really tied together by a set of representations in visual representations, which gathers, quote unquote, the nation together.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I think.
Sorry, just to say, sorry, just to make one more point. I'm sorry.
No, please.
I mean, you don't understand Fox News without not understanding that how Fox News becomes that point of gathering the nation, or the Trumpian nation, let's put it that way, how it gathers Trump's followers into a certain kind of understanding of itself. And it may be called alternative facts according to one of his aides, but it is gathering people in a certain kind of sense, this right across the country, in an understanding of themselves, and being able to see themselves and hear their beliefs, or extended or reinscribed through the visual. And that to me is something that we need to, and to me, therefore, it's the creation of certain fantasy. And that's one of the things we need to think about. Sorry.
No, thank you. I actually couldn't agree more. I'm right after this conversation, I'm going to send you a piece I wrote on the spectacle, but in a different context. Mm-hmm. But it's also something else. And you've you've just given me permission to talk about my earliest encounter with the U.S. So my father was dismissed from Pakistan International Airlines by Ziaul-Haq's government in 1981, I think it was. And he was declared an enemy of the state under something called Martial Law Regulation 52, and he applied for a green card through the processes, and he got it in 87. And we came to get the green card in 87, and 88 I started in college. But it was kind of interesting. He had an interesting relationship with the United States, never really lived here, just lived here for 2 years and went back, because the martial law regulation was actually overturned by Benazir Bhutto's government. That was part of her platform. And part of the reason he was dismissed was because of his ethnicity. And of course, this was, I've only now started to put it all together. And of course, this is fundamentally tied up to the American support for Ziaul-Haq. But at the same time, I come to the United States in 87, and I'm this nerdy little creature who is obsessed with politics, of course. We're good anti-colonial and all of that. And the Oliver North trials were on. The Iran-Contra trials were on. And I just watched them obsessively. I remember this is what I did. I sat in my uncle's New Jersey home, and I just watched them nonstop, right? And that, and I say this over and over again, and someday maybe I'll write about it. That, and then something else, Jerry Springer, which I didn't watch obsessively, right? but that I did watch, and I was horrified by it, right? And to me, those mingled into an image of America and the American spectacle, right? So when Trump got elected, I saw that as a culmination of that. I mean, of course, there's a longer history and all of that, but I wasn't at all surprised. I was like, of course, right? I mean, what do you expect? I mean, this is the imagination of the people,
Yes.
right? I mean, this is and this is a constructed imagination, which is also constructed through television after a certain point. Now, it's not insignificant that all of those talk shows are tied up to the breaking. You know, I think it was also had to do with the breaking of the writers' unions, right? So they were replacing one narrative form with another visual form. But I remember being absolutely blown away, right? And the other thing that I remember was, and again, I mean, you've got to understand, you've come from Pakistan, and I mean, we are very well traveled, obviously, because my father was in the airline and grown up partly in Singapore and all that. But at the same time, there's some, on the one hand, you're completely aware of America's imperial role in your own country, right, at that time. But at the same time, there's also some sense that, at least in America, these things don't quite happen the same way, right? And I'm watching this, and I'm watching death threats that are being given to people like Daniel Inouye at the time, right? Because I think he mentioned the Nuremberg trials. This is very, I mean, it's ancient history, right? Memory here. I'm getting old too, but it was a kind of, so to me, the country was always spectacle, right? And a horrifying spectacle, because it was a spectacle that was fundamentally kind of devoted to a certain kind of affect
Yes.
that was profoundly anti-intellectual, right? So any kind of careful, thought out position. Like Oliver North kept on saying, he would be asked about, and this is at least how I remember it, I could be wrong, did you purchase the security system? I think it was for your house. It was meant to be, I think it had something to do with taking kickbacks of some sort. I could be wrong, you know, this is memory. But he would be asked a kind of very straight political question, and he would say, I love my family, right? And I couldn't understand where this kind of affective performance of a certain kind of, I'm just a down home kind of guy, was coming from. Now that has begun to come through for me now when I'm reading Fenimore Cooper, right? And I'm teaching Fenimore Cooper, because there's this kind of, and even in The Searchers, where there's this character, the Martin Paul, I think it is, or Paul Martin Paul, I think, Marty, who is the kind of sidekick to the John Wayne figure, who's the stoic killer from D.H. Lawrence that Slotkin also cites. And then there's the Martin, who's the innocent guy, right? Who kind of, and it's his innocence that has to be protected, right? So that spectacle is fundamentally bound up with that kind of affect of innocence, right? And it keeps sustaining itself. And I was just really, and the fact that imagination then becomes, even as people are trying to distance themselves from it, so ingrained that it has to be catered to all the time, right? I think it, you know, you're helping us understand that, and I think it's very important that we take that on, and keep talking about that, right?
I mean, I agree, and I mean, what I would say to you is, which I think is important, is that there's always contestation in that imagination.
Yes.
And then, I mean, if you go back to the first article I wrote about what I thought Black Lives Matter meant, that what I thought Black Lives Matter meant, whether it would succeed or not, but what I thought it meant at that moment, with 26 million people marching in the streets, was that this was a really vigorous attempt in the middle of a pandemic to puncture that hegemony, and because it is that if you are, you know, it's I mean, this group, the Black folks are on the are the liminal group, to use Winter's words, are the, the so-called disposable bodies, the bodies of lack, and so on and so forth. To go back to Du Bois's, source of Black folks, Black folks are the folks that have second sight. There's double consciousness, but there's second sight. Second sight is the capacity to understand America, because America does not, really treats you outside of the system. Unless you are an exceptional, and I keep on, I think in the book I'm writing, I'm thinking, I'm arguing that there is a figure called the Negro, and Professor Judy has heard this. There's a figure called the Negro, which has been created, which is accepted within the boundaries of the so-called liberal inclusivity, but the Black is never, and cannot be accepted within the boundaries, because the Black is actually outside of, and in fact the antithesis, to use that word, of the liberal system itself. So that I think that, while one is trying to understand the ways in which technologies of rule work in America, and I really think that's important. Because if you don't understand it, you can't, in my view, you can't oppose it. You can't, you can't struggle against it. One also has to understand that there has always been another current, another set of practices which have challenged those technologies, which have talked about a different kind of world, a different a different possibility. Right. And it is that business of what is the different possibility that, to me, also makes America really interesting. About how can you have a different kind of America, that actually reworks what common association is supposed to look like. Rework us as, creates the grounds for us to really, for us to think about freedom, not emancipation, but, to create a ground for freedom, what those kind of freedom practices may look like, not normative sort of things, but actually set of practices that we make up as we go along. Because, I want to use Fanon, because because the question is always of, of bringing invention into existence, of using our imagination to think about what are the different sets of possibilities. So I agree with you, but I also want to make that point, because I think that's, I don't, it's sometimes when you focus sometimes on the technologies of rule, and I give a talk on that, somebody said, "Oh my God, Tony, you have made me absolutely despondent," and I am not a despondent person. I am actually a person that believes, that thinks that really is I'm an optimist, not because I am a silly person, but because I actually think about theory with history. And and I always say to myself that, what history tells me, or what I understand history to mean, is that there's always human striving. There's always people trying to think through what it is, what can we do on the systems of domination. So I want to make that point as well.
But I know, I think that's very important, and I think that which is a great segue to wrapping up to the final point, which is really about Black internationalism and Black radicalism, right? Which is so fundamental to your work, and and I should say that I completely agree, right? So I'm not in that sense, I don't believe in the absolute foreclosure of human resistance ever, right? So I think that on the one hand, I want to throw in a term that Gerald Wisner uses, again, just because I want to, I think it's very important for post-colonialists to also, and especially South Asian post-colonialists, to engage with the Native American question, which we haven't done, I believe, or at all. So he uses this wonderful term survivance about Native peoples, right, which is a combination of resistance and survival. Right? And I think that's also part of the life practices. So I've gotten interested in the literature. But then there's the other side of the other side of the two inaugural sins, right, which is the Black is racial slavery, which is, of course, not just an American event. It's a global event. And I'm glad you brought up Sylvia Winters, because of course her notion of the triadic civilization, of the triadic world civilization, Europe, Black, and Native, is become increasingly interesting and important to me too. And thank you for bringing so much of her work. Thank you for enabling even more of her work to come out. The conclusion of your final piece is the road ahead. So in keeping with precisely not giving in, right? So not a Foucauldian in that sense, right? Not just about government, the technology of rule, or biopolitics, but also the resistance to it. You say that I will end with reflections which come from Atlanta. Between 1956 and 57, King delivered 2 specific speeches, which I now recall. The titles of the speeches were The Birth of a New Age and The Birth of a New Nation. Of course, and clearly there's got to push back against Birth of a Nation there too, in that title. In both, King called for America to transform itself and observed that the divisions in the nation would not be overcome unless attention was paid to poverty, racial domination, and general exploitation. In calling then for a beloved community, he was not asking for America to be an exception, but rather a community where radical forms of equality and freedom are present. To begin this journey, America needs to confront its historical myths, as well as create economic and social policies in which, as King said, we will be lifted from the long night of poverty. Central to any form of progressive American politics will be this Black tradition of political action and thinking that King was part of. The reason is a simple one. To a large degree, the historical myths which drive conservative American political ideas rest upon the material basis of racial slavery, anti-Black racism. To defeat Trumpism also means to overturn white supremacy. In order to do that, we might do well to call upon a tradition of political action and thinking of those who were enslaved and their long political and social struggles to create a different America. I would expand that last to say to create a different world, right? Because of course you're from the Caribbean.
Yeah.
You have a foot in South Africa. Those practices, Black internationalism, Du Bois was talking, not just the whites. I've been teaching the souls of white folk as well for my Europe project. And he's talking about the Wilsonian moment and its problems, to come back to something you said earlier, right? So America does have not just a presence in Berlin, but then of course after World War I, it has a presence in the decolonizing struggles. He's joining the decolonizing nations to be careful. Right.
Yeah.
This is not going to end the way you think it will, and he was right. But of course, this is a world phenomena. I mean, so in some sense, I would say that, drawing, of course, in readings of your work, of R.A. Judy's work, of Paul Gilroy's work, a whole tradition of Black radical thinking, and Cedric Robinson, and so on, right, and Du Bois is. And C.L.R. James, of course, which is, by the way, just so you know, I wanted to say this to you, that the reason I became a post-colonialist was C.L.R. James and Derek Walcott. I read I don't know if you know that. I don't think I've ever told you this, but it was reading Derek Walcott and C.L.R. James, Beyond the Boundary and Another Life. Made me a post-colonialist. And I've got back to that in some of the recent work. But I think that, it's, so on the one hand, a different America, on the other hand, a different world, because of Black Lives Matter has gotten picked up all over the world, right? Of course, Black Lives Matter, I would say, is also somewhat influenced or inspired by the movements that were taking place in, not influenced, but there's a global ferment, right, around even the Tunisian Revolution and so on. But there's a kind of Black radical tradition that is both useful for the transformation here, but is also global, right? So how about we conclude by talking about that?
Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. Let me begin to try and answer that. Actually, beginning to go back to that piece. One of the strictures of journalism is that you have only X amount of words. And one of the things I crossed out in the second draft of that article was that the before I wrote, A New Nation and a New Age, that that actually came out of a set of ideas King had developed in Ghana. That he had gone to Ghana for Ghana independence in '57,
Mhm.
and he says it very clearly in the speech. But you have always have as I said, the strictures of journalism is you have
Sure.
2,000 whatever words you
I
have
know. I've had to do it myself.
to.
Yes. Yes.
But I want to begin there because one of the things that we don't think about is we don't think about the relationship of the anti-colonial struggle to the actual Black radical tradition in the United States. And I would then say to you that those two speeches are deeply influenced by his conversations with Kwame Nkrumah and what he sees in Ghana and his meeting of other people who are trying to think about African political independence. In fact, he talks in the speech, one of the speeches, he talks about the fact of African political independence and what that means for Black people generally. Okay. All right. So that's the first point. The second point that I would want to make is that the Black radical tradition is a tradition that has many currents in it. So I don't like to say that there's a kind of one current that, because when you do that, you're looking for master keys, and I don't think there's master key to any part of our human experience. So it has many currents in it. However, one of the currents that I say I associate with is a current that actually thinks the following way. Firstly, that that racial slavery and I keep on now saying Indian this in Native American dispossession, but racial slavery was actually not separate from capitalism, but actually was capitalism and shaped capitalism itself. And and therefore, when you begin to think like that, then you begin to have to say to yourself, okay, questions that we think about capitalism, whether it is commodification, alienation, etc., all those things take on a different valence. When you begin to think about now that of somebody as being property in person. In other words, if you take the question of commodification, as we think about it in critical thought, is that commodification happens when you create commodities and you yourself become commodified, etc. But what happens if from Jump Street, from day one, you are property in person? So you are both property in person in terms of being a commodity, but then you actually produce commodities, right, for the market. So okay, how does that mean that we have to rethink questions of what capitalism look like? So that's, to me, is just is one of the things that I would want to think about. Now I know what some theorists would say, okay, when we put race in it, what we have to do is rethink capitalism. I say that is at one level. I say yes, I agree, but a more fundamental level is to think through the actual categories of capitalism itself, that of labor, exploitation, domination, alienation, etc. Thinking through those categories and then trying to think about, when you put Black African slaves in the mix, how do those fundamental categories change? And then thirdly, when you do that, okay, what new ways can we begin to think about a new life? What new ways can we think about the possibilities of what the new would look like? So you're right, this is not just about America, this is actually about the world. And the way I put it is really is to say, okay, not that when you do that, that you will have the answer to everything. Because if we had the answer to everything, we would not be in the position, the mess that we are in. But that what is important is to think through that when you begin to put the questions of slavery and dispossession in the mix as not separate from, but as actually integral and part of capitalism itself, then what you raise are a whole set of new questions that we all need to answer. Not now that these new questions, not all the questions, but new questions. So that when you put the indigenous in the mix, the questions of the ways in which I'm just finished reading something on the way in which the history of the thought about private property. And I put that in European Western thought. And I put that beside the ways in which, for example, indigenous people were thinking about property. And I said to myself, okay, there's a question of property and labor here, which is extremely important. I don't believe you can go back to things. There's no return to anything, right? Because that's not how human life is. But that what are some of the clues? What are some of the prompts within a set of traditions of people thinking differently about human life on the planet that may be important for us to construct in as a kind of critical set of thought and practices about living on the planet, and living on the earth, quite frankly, in a different way. So that's how I think of the tradition of as a working, almost like a toolkit, to use that awful word, but almost but as a working frame, one working frame that may help us to begin to grapple with what is our human experience now, what it has been historically, and therefore what are some of the fundamental questions on the table that may allow us to begin to think and then act a different way later on, so that this planet doesn't collapse under the nonsense and the mess that has been created.
That we have created. I think that's a wonderful moment to end. Thank you so much for writing the article, for being you, and for agreeing to have this conversation. I hope we can have you back at some point. But it's been delightful and helped me think all kinds of things through.
All right, good. Thank you very much. And you take care of yourself, okay?
All right, you too.
Good. Bye-bye.
Okay.